President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for trade rules to be recalibrated to provide policy space for developing countries to industrialize. The president says stated this in his message for the 30th anniversary of the World Trade Organization. The WTO is a global entity that deals with rules and regulations related to international trade amongst countries. Now, currently, more than 80% of global trade takes place under the World Trade Organization rules-based system. Our president says that developing countries that account for most of the WTO's membership remain locked into the lower end of the global value chains. But he says that the inclusivity promised by the multilateral trading system and by the Doha Development Round has not materialized for many. Ramaphosa says that the multilateral trading system must be strengthened or risk the encroachment of a global trade regime based on power dynamics. Cameroon will host the 14th Ministerial Conference of the WTO. It's happening in 2026. Ramaphosa says this will be an opportunity to define a clear path on reform.
Across the globe, the constraints and potential overreach of the rules are limiting access to key policy tools that are required to promote sustainable development. South Africa reaffirms its support for the reform initiative that is being spearheaded by the Director General of the WTO. We must redouble our efforts to ensure that trade supports development. WTO rules must facilitate structural transformation that integrates developing countries into the global trade. The WTO is called upon to assert its role in ensuring that global trade works for all. WTO reform must be development-centric. Consensus-based decision-making in the WTO must remain paramount for all of us.
All right, so Associate Professor of Economics at Wits Business School, Professor Chris Malikane joins us now for more. Prof, good evening, and thank you for joining us here on the SABC at this hour. Perhaps we can start off by unpacking these inequalities. Talk to us really about the general structuring of the trade agreements, how it is to the disadvantage of developing nations. I mean, there's trade liberalization, unfair exposure, unequal access, amongst others. Perhaps you can unpack that a little bit more for us.
Yes, good evening, Lisa. Good evening to the viewers. So basically, the World Trade Organization has got some objectives that it has set. It says that through these agreements, it seeks to establish a predictable and transparent system of tariff setting by countries globally. And secondly, through this system, it wants to achieve full employment and sustainable development and increasing standards of living and real incomes of the people. But for developing countries, that has not been the case. So what you find is this, that there are power relations that exist between advanced economies and developing countries in negotiating these agreements. Because if you are powerless in terms of economic power and even military power, then you are in a disadvantaged position to drive a hard bargain on these rules. So what you'd find is that even if advanced economies open their markets, they use what you call non-tariff barriers, setting standards, making licensing conditions for you to operate in their economies very difficult, etc., etc. So that then limits the capacity of developing countries to access those markets. Yet, when it comes to these advanced economies, their goods accessing developing countries, it's easier for them to do that. And it comes with conditionalities tied to issues of aid, etc. So that is where the power relations in the negotiations around trade agreements come in.
Yeah, so Prof, thank you for painting that succinct picture, because now we're looking at the way forward and ways in which this can be addressed without rearranging the chairs on the decks of the Titanic, because these dynamics are not working. How can we begin to address this? How can developing nations also rally together, perhaps to leverage more in terms of those power dynamics? I mean, really, what is part of that agency approach?
Yeah, you are correct. You know, the former president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, tried to organize countries in the South. And his argument was that countries in southern economies or developing countries are disorganized. They need to be united as a force so that they can confront an organized North to address issues of trade. And there he was talking about monopoly in pricing the goods that are produced by people in the South. So even if we can reform WTO, the rules, but at the end of the day, it is the multinationals that are controlling production and pricing of commodities and services that are produced by countries in the South. So there's underneath some power relations that exist in global markets beyond what we see in WTO. And another dimension that we need to look at is the capacity of countries to effectively reap benefits from the trade system, global trade system, depends on the ownership of the decisive means of production in their economies. In South Africa, for example, even if we were to get a fair pricing of our minerals, but our minerals are not owned by South Africans. So the owners of these big mining companies, which are largely foreign, are going to also reap the benefits. So the precondition for us to effectively engage fairly in the trading system is for us to resolve the property and ownership question of our decisive parts of the economy. They should be under national control. And then only then can we talk about benefiting from the trade system.
Prof, you're proposing a much debated idea. Thank you for weighing in on that. So beyond tariffs and non-tariff barriers, I also just want to look at what the consequences have been to date. So, is there a lack of enforcement if there is inequalities to mitigate against that? I mean, what does that look like in the past? But perhaps also now that South Africa is hosting the G20 summit, is there an opportunity for South Africa to assert itself and the continent at large and to make greater gains? Is this more hopeful at this point?
Yeah, well, South Africa is in a position to put forward arguments that are well thought out, economic arguments that advance the interest of people in the South. But at the end of the day, it's about power. You see it in the US, they are very clear. They say that, look, we've lowered tariffs for global economies, European economies, Japan, China, and everyone. We've lowered. The system was saying that the Americans should lead in the process of facilitating global trade by lowering their tariffs. They say that they've done that, but the other countries did not follow in lowering their tariffs. The impact of that has been that the American trade balance has been in deficit structurally. So, and manufacturing in the US has been hemorrhaged, and that is an issue of national security for the Americans now. So they want the reciprocal trade tariffs to be applied. They just want fairness in the system. When it comes to us, if we want fairness in the system, like I said, even if the tariffs are enforced, everything is done correctly, the South Africans still will have to resolve that underlying problem of price setting in the global markets. For example, the price of platinum, although we produce more than 80% of the world's platinum, right? But the price of platinum is not set in South Africa, and that creates imbalances in trade underneath these tariffs.
Yes, and so as we mitigate against those inequalities and inequities, I think the issue of leadership also comes to the fore and representation as well. So we're looking at the DG of the WTO, Dr. Ngozi Iweala, and I want to look at her tenure to date, the impact that she's had upon her appointment. I mean, this was obviously hopeful for the continent, at least when it comes to agency, but in effect, how effective has she been? How would you weigh in on her tenure to date?
Well, she has tried to raise issues. These issues, they are old, but she has tried to push them. And given the current state of affairs, it's a question of negotiating and finding a path to get the major trading partners in the world to take into account the crisis that is facing developing countries. It's a consistent, persistent process of always negotiating. But economies, she can push and push, but at the end of the day, economies are looking after their national interest. They want to structure the system in their national interest. So perhaps this is the high time that the African Union, begins to have a structured approach towards these trade negotiations globally. But for us to approach them as single small countries, South Africa there, Nigeria there, Lesotho, it does not help. We are confronting big powers here, the US, the UK, Germany, France, China, how can Lesotho negotiate with China? You need that African mass. So we need to sort out our problems first on the continent, at least on that scale. And then we can then broaden to the south.
And which obviously looks at timelines. How quickly is this also going to be enforced? We're looking at issues of the AfCFTA, which is something you've alluded to as a means to look at positive growth. Perhaps even just the ratings agency, the Africa Ratings Agency. I mean, whether that's skewed in our favor or not, and the need for that. I know these are all discussions that are happening. We're going to have to leave the conversation there. Perhaps we'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Prof, for your time at this hour and for weighing in. Associate Professor of Economics at Wits Business School, Professor Chris Malikane, of course, just weighing in some of the development economics that is transpiring this following 30 years of the World Trade Organization, and really the geopolitical landscape that is shifting as the dynamics ensue between the trade wars between the USA and China, and of course the ripple effects that it's having on countries the world over.